Good afternoon, everybody. This is Chris Daggett. This is the Lead in Drinking Water, a Permanent Solution for New Jersey webinar. We're going to start by having Ed DeFiglia from New Jersey Future go through some of the webinar instructions. Ed?
Thank you, Chris. So for everyone who's joined today, you are all muted for the participants. If you have any questions, you will see at the top of your screen in the Join Me button, there is a little talk bubble. You can click on that and send us any questions you may have, just technical, or when we get to the question and answer part of the day, we'll be using that to answer your questions. If you have any other technical difficulties, you can email Julia McBride here at New Jersey Future at jmcbride@newjerseyfuture.org. She's the one who sent out your confirmation emails, so you should have her contact information handy. Again, if you have any issues during the conference call or the webinar, you can just use the chat function at the top. And there, yeah. Okay. All right. Back to you, Chris.
Sorry, everybody, I got cut off. So somehow, I don't know if anybody else did. I hope not. You see before you the list of the speakers today. It's myself, Mike Furrey from the American Waterworks Association, Chris Sturm from New Jersey Future, and Gary Brune also from New Jersey Future. The agenda is just basically an overview of the primary recommendations, a summary of those recommendations, and then hopefully we'll have 15 minutes of question and answers, and then a little bit about next steps for implementation and a way to get some more information. If we can move to the slide, the health impacts of lead in drinking water. For those of you who may not be aware, although I think there's been a lot in the press of late, there really is no safe level of lead in the human body, and recent science is showing us that relatively low levels of lead can cause significant harm. The health impacts are particularly acute on young children up to age 6 and for pregnant women. Lead overall in drinking water is about 20% of the lead exposure problem, which occurs mostly in soils and in lead paint. But for infants who are formula fed, using drinking water as their to mix the formula, for those kids it's as much as 60%. So it's a big issue, and for adults, it can be, even with moderate exposure, you can have elevated blood pressure, you can have heart and kidney disease, and you can have anemia. For little kids, you basically can have behavioral problems, and for pregnant women, low birth weight, reduced fetal growth, and miscarriage. The pathways for lead exposure, I just mentioned. The places of exposure are in the home, child care facilities, and schools, which are the obvious locations that people get that exposure. If I can move to the lead service lines, if we have that slide, can we go to that? So lead service lines are typically the major part of the problem associated with lead in drinking water. Typically, as you can see from the drawing there, lead service lines, and unfortunately, have two components to it, one of which is on public property and one of which is on private property, which is part of the problem we deal with. Lead service lines are often very old. Records of them are very spotty with both communities or municipalities when it's a publicly owned utility, as well as for the private sector. In New Jersey, the estimate is there's some 350,000 lead service lines, which is the 5th highest number in the United States. As you can see, still on this drawing, the property line problem is, and we'll get to this later in more detail, but when it's privately owned, there are certain questions about access to the line, and if you only replace half of the lead service line, you can actually exacerbate the problem if you do just the street portion up to the curb or the sidewalk and not do the section between the sidewalk and the building. The lead in drinking water issue is widespread in New Jersey. A survey of water utilities issued by the DEP in August this year identified 104 water systems with lead service lines, and that number is expected to grow as more information is collected and we get better and better sources of data. Approximately 200 water utilities, or 1/3 of the 582 total community water systems in the state, provide corrosion control treatment, which is to prevent lead from leaching into drinking water. There's over 380 school districts that have had lead exceedances in at least one outlet in 2017. So the intensity of lead service lines in New Jersey, there's a map that you see now before you, and the redder it gets, the more intense, and it's a heavier concentration, not only it's basically in areas with older housing. So because lead pipe is malleable, it enabled water utilities to navigate around tight spaces in the water distribution system. And Congress didn't outlaw lead pipes and lead solder until 1986. So if a home is built before 1986, it's got a significant chance that there's lead in the plumbing or lead service lines in the street. Pre-1940 homes are a particular concern. Lead use was slowly dropped afterwards until it was outlawed by Congress in '86. This map is a DEP survey, again, as of August 2019, but there's 150 inventory submissions either still pending or under review by DEP. So again, this number, the total number, is likely to grow over time. The task force that put this report together is a task force of Jersey Waterworks, which is a diverse statewide collaborative of over 500 members with the common purpose of strengthening New Jersey's water infrastructure. There were 30 task force members. We had experts from water utilities, federal, state, and local agencies, community organizations, academia, and scientists. The study started in 2018 in December, and it went for 10 months until the press conference we held last month. There's some 19 recommendations, and it's, we believe, the first study of its kind where you had a statewide review led by a nonprofit organization, in this case New Jersey Future, with generous funding from the Fund for New Jersey, for which we have been greatly appreciative. The guiding principles of the report, it's focused on children. The focus is to make sure that it is fair and equitable, because lead is really an environmental justice issue. Lead exceedances are fairly concentrated in urban areas with older housing, and given the differences in wealth in New Jersey towns, our main goal is to prevent young children from being exposed simply due to local fiscal or financial constraints. We also wanted to make recommendations that were permanent to avoid temporary expediencies like filters or partial solutions, as I indicated before about lead service lines where you only do half of it, the street portion that's on public property. And we also are focusing on that the methods would be cost efficient. So we want to do a methodical lead service line replacement across entire neighborhoods, because we can have a savings of some 25 to 30%. For example, if we go into a street, we don't want to do 3 houses because we can't get access to the private property. We want to do every house on the street and not have to do partial now and then partial later. We want to do entire neighborhoods at a time. The recommendations, again, there's a total of 19. They fall into 5 categories. A statewide campaign that we're calling to be a coordinated statewide effort among the various agencies and the governor's office that have jurisdiction over either some form of lead in drinking water. So statewide campaign, lead service line replacement, protective and regulatory measures, child care in schools, and financial resources. A number of these are interdependent. Several of them, or 4 of the recommendations, require legislation. and this webinar is going to present the primary recommendations. Our general goal is to eliminate the risk of lead in drinking water in 10 years. It's a little bit more aggressive than other states. It's been typically 15 to 20 years as a target, but we believe this is doable if the resources and the legislative authority are provided. That legislative authority already has several bills in the hopper, which were some testimony taken yesterday, which we'll discuss a little bit later on. But there does seem to be good action that's beginning in the state, and we're hopeful that in the end we can complete this project in about 10 years. So with that, let me turn it over to Gary Brune, who is going to talk a little bit more about the recommendations in greater detail. Gary?
Thank you, Chris. Gary Brune, New Jersey Future. I just want to touch on the first area of recommendations, which is a coordinated statewide campaign and the need for that. One of the quickest things we can do to be effective is to communicate with the public about the risk of lead poisoning, and that's basically what this is about. There's basically two parts of this recommendation. One is to declare lead as a public health threat. For many years, we've known about lead in not only water, but paint and soil. We also know two other things, that the problem is statewide here in New Jersey, and that any meaningful, drastic reduction of the lead problem is going to require a series of difficult decisions and some bold leadership. So there's a need to maximize public awareness of the problem and the importance of solving it. I would just close this one by saying we don't think this is a public emergency. It's no additional powers are needed, but we do need to communicate better about the problem. The other thing to mention is there's a need here for a lead ombudsman type position. We have at least 8 state agencies here in New Jersey involved in this issue, most prominently environmental protection, health, education, and children and families. The lead issue is complex, and complex problems often cut across departmental boundaries. So the role of a lead ombudsman, which ideally might be attached to the governor's office to provide it to sufficiently empower the position, would be to look at issues that are cross-cutting and resolve them. Things like data sharing, the linking of existing databases, and holistic inspections where we send someone into a house and not only look for water, but also check for lead, paint, and soil. These are all some examples of what the lead ombudsman might do.
Great, thanks, Gary. So I'm going to talk about the recommendations to remove lead service lines and how to pay for that. Lead service lines are the largest source of lead in water, and so replacing them is one of the task force's primary goals. The experience of water utilities up to date is that this is very hard to accomplish. It's costly. We don't know where the lead service lines are in many cases. And even when utilities offer to replace them for free, property owners, including both residents and absentee landlords, often refuse to cooperate. So the goal of our task force was to come up with really practical solutions to kind of break through that situation. And we have 4 interlocking recommendations. Replacing lead service lines in 10 years, supported by financial solutions, which I'll talk about. Understanding where lead service lines are, both through inventories and through disclosure. And let me start with disclosure. The theory here is that anyone who's buying a home or moving into a new rental unit should know whether or not there's a lead service line or interior lead plumbing. And that's just not the case today. People have been burying their heads in the sand. So what's needed is legislation that requires that either the seller or the landlord produce a certificate showing that the unit is free of lead, and this should be not only water but also paint and soil. And if that information is not available, then an inspection should be done to determine whether or not there's a lead service line or lead plumbing, and that should be provided to the buyer or the renter before they move in. We also suggested some ways that municipalities could enforce this provision. The second aspect is having utilities, who are really on the front lines of this work, do a more complete lead service line inventory. DEP is already asking them to conduct inventories, and they've got a good start, but we need more complete information. These inventories have to be comprehensive and clearly requiring both the portion that's owned by the utility and also the portion that's underneath private property. The inventory needs to specify if the line is lead, if it's known to be not lead and what material it is, and then if it's unknown. And this information needs to be updated every year until DEP determines that the drinking water utility is done and all the lead service lines have been replaced. We also want to see goosenecks included. We want transparency so that this information is on the local water system website with addresses, which you can find today at the City of Newark, and on DEP's website in a summary form so that we can track water system by water system how we're doing on lead service lines. When it comes to the, no, go back one, please. When it comes to the program itself, again, all lead service lines, the goal is to replace them in 10 years. To ban partial lead service line replacements, and except for in emergency situations. Half of a lead service line is still a lead service line. And the vision is to do this in a way that allows utilities to replace every lead service line on a block at the same time to lower costs. And so in order to accomplish that, utilities need to have the authority to access the property even if it hasn't been granted. So that legislation is needed for that. And this needs to be available at no cost to property owners. Many property owners can't afford even a partial contribution, and even if they can, if they don't want to provide it, that just gums up the works. And so as a practical matter, we are seeing the City of Newark move forward with exactly this approach and their very aggressive goal to replace all lead service lines in 2 or 3 years. Now the next big question, of course, is how do we pay for this? The cost estimate statewide is about $2 billion based on, imperfect information on the number of lead service lines, of course. And this whole operation is complicated, as Chris Daggett mentioned, by the fact that most of the lead service lines are jointly owned by the utility and by, private property owners. So the task force spent a lot of time on this, and they came up with a two-pronged solution. First is to authorize rate recovery and the use of rate revenues, and second is to provide a subsidy program to the neediest communities. The rate recovery is based on the premise that almost all the revenues that water utilities have comes from rates, about 95%. And so they need to have the authority to use those rates to replace lead service lines regardless of their ownership. This is a public health threat, and that's one of the reasons why Gary talked about the importance of viewing and understanding this as an important public health threat. Legislation is needed to authorize utilities to use rates to replace this. There's precedent in other states, including Indiana, Pennsylvania, and Missouri. We think that authorization should just be for the 10-year period. And importantly, that investor-owned utilities not be allowed to make profit on this operation. This should be done as part of their operations and maintenance, but not adding the customer portion of the service line to their asset base. And so it also means that everyone who pays water rates would be contributing to the solution. We think that over 10 years, in most cases, this rate increase would not be very big, and in some cases would not even be noticeable. But in some cases, it would create problems, and that takes us to our next slide. If this is a state priority, then we believe there's an important role for the state government to ensure that this mission can be accomplished by every water utility. And so that means that even water utilities that have a lot of lead service lines, that have fiscal distress, that have customers who can't afford rate increases, can participate fully in this program. And so we recommended, the task force recommended, a state subsidy program of $500 million that would be provided to those water utilities who needed it the most. And so, as we prepared these recommendations, it raises certain questions of fairness, which the legislature discussed yesterday. The task force really came down on the side of a practical solution that could be implemented. And now I'm going to turn it over to Mike Furrey, who's going to talk to us about how people stay safe in their homes.
Hi, thanks a lot, Chris. Hi, my name is Mike Furrey. I'm the owner and president of Agri-Environmental and Laboratory Services. I'm here today representing the American Water Works Association, the New Jersey section. I want to mention right off the bat, we worked on the task force. It was a very good collaborative effort. We want to continue that. We want to thank New Jersey Future and New Jersey Waterworks for inviting us on to speak about some of the practical things or the technical things that the water industry is faced with today. So protecting people in their homes. Chris talked about all the lead service lines. Beyond the lead service lines, inside the house, there's sources of lead from fittings, valves, lead solder. So how do you protect oneself from lead inside a home? This is what we commonly refer to as premise plumbing, and we feel that that's a big part of a possible source of lead. And so how do you do that to manage inside the home or commercial business? So on this slide of protective regulatory measures, you go to the slide, we talk about different elements of how to protect the public from lead exposure. For a water industry, we look at a lot of water sampling issues. One of the other elements of lead in drinking water is public education. How do we educate the public? We have licensed water utility operators that operate these treatment plants on a daily basis. And then there's some protective measures we can do holistically through some kind of inspections. When we talk about sampling is a complicated issue. The water systems are required to do a number of samples every year, every 3 years, once a year, several times during a year. And they're also required to take a lot of lead and copper samples and also what we call water quality parameter testing, and some of the water quality parameters that are important for corrosion control. So water quality parameters such as pH, alkalinity, orthophosphate, all the different types of treatment possibilities. So for the most part, water systems have the options of adjusting their pH to provide a protective measure, or add some kind of corrosion inhibitor to prevent lead from leaching into the pipes. We are normally used to what we call 90th percentile action limit, where a number of samples can be over the 15 parts per billion, and people can still be exposed to lead, and how to deal with those remaining residents or commercial properties that have these high levels of lead. And so when we talk about water sampling, one of the main objectives for the task force is to make a recommendation that the New Jersey DEP possibly adopt its own version of the lead and copper rule, possibly ahead of the EPA rule that has just recently been issued. So the DEP is actively working on looking at all the elements of the lead and copper rule and trying to strengthen it and modernize it. Some of the new concepts that are being floated are things like sequential sampling, where you not only look at the first draw of lead when you take samples, but to look at different parts over time and see where the lead is coming from. There's also new analytical techniques that can identify exact sources of lead, and so a lot of the technology is available and it's coming out. Rutgers University, NJDEP, they're working on pipe testing, analyzing the pipes, analyzing the water to see exactly where the lead is coming from. So when we talk about public education, and once you have a lead exceedance, the water utilities have a certain amount of time period to notify the public. After the monitoring period's over, they have 60 days to start their public education requirements. And then each individual water customer who is part of that sampling pool, all the water utilities, once they're notified of the lead test result, they have 30 days to notify the consumer of that high lead test result, no matter what, if it's under the action level or even above the action level. Under the EPA proposed rule, this time requirement may drop down to within 24 hours of being notified of the high lead content. So there's a more aggressive, transparent public education requirement that will possibly be coming down the line. So another element of the people who make these, the engineers, the scientists, and the licensed water utility operators. We're trying to strengthen, one of the recommendations is to strengthen the licensed operator program, to rework the regulations, and to make it more attractive for licensed water treatment operators to come into the business, because these are the ones that are monitoring the treatment, they're providing the treatment, they're adding the chemicals, they're reporting water quality issues to the public, and then most importantly, if there are issues, they're helping resolve these compliance issues if in fact they have lead or copper problems. And this is an ongoing process, and licensed operators play a big part in that role. Corrosion control is a pretty key part of compliance for water utilities. If you treat the water correctly, you could minimize that lead exposure, and that could be done through proper treatment. So one of the other elements of the regulatory process is a more holistic inspection approach to looking at lead in drinking water. There's several different requirements. The Department of Health may have requirements for testing in hospitals. There's already daycare requirements for lead and copper, and then obviously we already talked about lead in drinking water in the actual schools. One of the things I wanted to mention about lead in schools, as part of the EPA rule, when water systems look at their sampling pool, they may be required to add a certain amount of percentage of locations in schools where the highest risk of lead in drinking water can be found. So that's the more holistic approach. That's what we're going to try to accomplish through some of the recommendations we made. If you go to the next slide, we talk about research studies, things that are going on in the industry. One of the big recommendations that the task force made was to have the Drinking Water Quality Institute examine the health effects of lead and to identify what levels of lead are safe and what levels can really cause health issues. So currently the action level is 15 parts per billion. Some of those levels have been looked at. We looked at it from the task force. We recommended that there needs to be more health studies done to identify what we think is a good level of lead that we can regulate. One of the concepts that the EPA has been considering is a household action level, which is different than the current rule. That household action level has turned into what they now consider a trigger level proposed by the EPA, and that trigger level is going to be set possibly at 10 parts per billion. So 10 parts per billion might be the new standard where within the home, or a commercial property, you may have to take action if you have exceedances over the 10 parts per billion. So obviously, what we're concerned about is the impact on pregnant women, infants, children, the more at-risk populations. So one of the last elements of our task under the regulatory process is how do you educate the population, or educate people that may be exposed to lead in drinking water. So one of the things that we recommended was to have some kind of uniform message, which is a difficult thing to do, but to have a uniform message that tells the actual health impacts of lead and how to minimize that. One of the other recommendations were to come up with a grant program, to come up with state grants to community organizations for personal outreach, door-to-door in some cases, to get out and talk to people and to tell them about the risks of lead and what the possibilities that you could reduce that risk. Possibly using water filters that are rated correctly to remove lead, and how to install those and how to maintain them. So in general, this is a collaborative effort. This needs to be a collaborative effort between multiple agencies, the DEP, Department of Education, Department of Health, and communities, DCA, all working together to educate the population to reduce the risk of lead. So with that, I'll turn it over to the next speaker.
Thank you, Mike. This is Gary Brune, New Jersey Future. We're going to talk in this segment about recommendations for child care facilities and school facilities. Some of these recommendations apply to both. Some of them apply just to individually to the child care or the school area. So the first segment of recommendations, the very first one has to do with getting both of these facilities on the same uniform sampling cycle. Today, schools in New Jersey sample for lead in the water every 6 years, and child care facilities are sampling every 3. The recommendation is to get them both on a 3-year cycle. 6 years to us seems particularly long, particularly because young children are involved. And I would note that 25% of the child care facilities are located physically in school buildings. So getting them on the same uniform sampling cycle makes a lot of sense from an efficiency standpoint as well. The next thing is, in both the cases of Department of Education and Department of Community, Children and Families, neither department has a data system at the moment that can easily respond to inquiries about lead testing. So there's a whole data improvement section that's needed here. We think the data should be publicly available. There should be a statewide summary. By the way, and it should include all the test results, positive and negative. The information should be provided on how the lead exceedances were addressed in these facilities. And there should be a data portal, which should remove the departments from being in the middle on this. A data portal that information could be updated, or input, I should say, directly, because doing so would minimize input errors, it would quicken the process, and it would help ensure some consistency across the database. The next one listed here is the idea of requiring drinking water management plans for how do these facilities plan to remediate when a problem occurs. Today in New Jersey, state licensed child care facilities nor schools are required to remediate. In some cases, temporary solutions like bottled water have been in place for years. And we think through regulation, there should be a requirement that they submit a drinking water management plan. Is just a fancy term for how am I going to remediate the problem. And those plans should be published so that parents and the interested parents can see what the plan is. And the last thing to mention is that the term differential standards in the state of Illinois has a unique approach on this. They've looked at, and they've differentiated, frankly, or basically about how they have dealt with different types of facilities based on their compliance. So if a facility has historically been compliant and has not had a lead exceedance issue, it has no lead service line, and it doesn't plan to change its water source or alter its indoor plumbing, they would not have to perform lead testing at license renewal. We would suggest they simply do spot checks on that basis. But others who do have meet one of those definitions would be subject to the typical lead testing at license renewal cycle. They would retest again 6 months after the remediation is completed, and annually thereafter until compliance is shown over 2 consecutive monitoring periods. So the basic point here is that instead of in a regulatory sense treating everybody the same, there would be a different approach for different facilities. Those are the joint measures. Moving to the child care specific measures. These are only measures that would be specific to child care facilities. In the state of New Jersey, there is a financial assistance being provided for schools. We'll talk about that in a minute, but there is no financial assistance provided to state licensed or privately run facilities in New Jersey. There should be some at least contemplation of whether there's a need for that. I would note there's 4,200 state licensed child care facility, state licensed child care facility operations in New Jersey, and there's at least 1,400 voluntarily registered family-run centers. So we're talking about a lot of potential exposure for the age group of 0 to 6 that we're most worried about here. There should be a study of whether there's a lower action limit. I think Mike Furrey mentioned action limits before. Should the action limit be lower in child care facilities? In the state of Illinois, it's 2 parts per billion, as opposed to the 15 parts per billion that the current EPA rule requires. That's 90% or lower. And if that's warranted, the key issue is what really is the lower level that protects the public in a cost-efficient way. And the last point is on privately run facilities, we think there's a need to expand the outreach to these facilities to encourage more of them to voluntarily register. The City of Boston also has offered free water testing to those facilities to help them along in terms of the issue. The last set of measures has to do with they're specific to schools. There's been $100 million of state bonds that's been provided relatively recently for water infrastructure improvements in the schools, of which lead is one. The Department of Education and DEP are both working on the spending guidelines to go with that. And one of our main points here is that we would like to see, one of our recommendations is the intersection of high lead and fiscal distress. Cities that are, have financial challenges, those school districts, I should say, should be the first priority in terms of how those funds are to be used. some of the priorities for remediation we would suggest by school district would be, do they have buildings where contamination is already detected? We would suggest they also elevate the elementary schools as the first order of business, given the age of the children in those schools, and the age of the school building as well is another factor they should consider. We also would suggest that diagnostic testing, the type of lead testing that may help determine where the problem is, because in the schools, by the way, the problem is typically indoor plumbing. It's not typically the lead service line, and that's because the service lines serving the schools tend to be larger and tend not to be lead. We think diagnostic testing should be an eligible cost, and if at all possible, that we should avoid major plumbing renovations, which are terrifically expensive. There's other issues like automated flushing that the city of Chicago has done to great success that may pose another way to solve the problem. Last thing to mention here is that there's a series of lessons learned from 2017 testing, the first round of testing that was done. Just briefly, they are to collect and publish all the results in a comprehensive database, to clearly define the outlets that require testing and those that do not. I think there was some confusion on that point. To train the school staff that are going to be doing the testing to make sure it's consistent, either that or hire a firm that has that expertise, and to maybe most importantly, inform the parents through some high-profile information campaign in multiple languages. So that's a quick sense of the child care and school recommendations. I'm going to turn it back to Chris Daggett for what is the Q&A portion of this webinar.
Thank you, Gary, and thank you, Mike, and thank you, Chris Sturm. You see on the slide, you can access the full report at jerseywaterworks.org/lead report. In the questions and answers, I want to just remind you that we're not going to do it by verbally, but we are requesting that you submit questions via the chat box. And then I'm going to turn it back to either Ed or Gary. I'm not sure who's going to actually start reading some of the questions that you may have already submitted during these presentations. So Mike or Gary or Chris?
So I guess I will take a first stab. But one of the questions is, can folks afford higher rates, particularly if they cannot afford the contribution to remediation? And I guess the point that we would make is that we thought long and hard about this. The city of Newark and the city of Trenton were the first cities in New Jersey to tackle this. Both originally required a $1,000 contribution as a cost share. I think Chris Sturm touched on this earlier. And that did dampen the participation. A lot of the urban areas, $1,000 is an awful lot of money. And so we were trying to set this up so that it would not require a cost share among the folks that needed to replace their lead service line. Instead, the combination of rates that are spread across the entire service area, and spread over the 10-year period that Chris was describing. The combination of that and the subsidy that we are recommending, where the state has a role to help the towns that have financial difficulty in doing this, would absolve the need for a individual cost share among people affected by this. So that would be the first answer to one of the first questions we have here. There's another question here about the absolute need for financial assistance for child care facilities, particularly the local, neighborhood, and independent ones. And that was what I was referring to before. The reason this is sort of preying on our mind is that the children aged 0 to 6, as I think Chris Daggett mentioned at the top, are particularly affected by lead. They have that blood-brain barrier issue going on, a lot of development in their bodies and at those ages, and lead is particularly something that they are susceptible to. So child care facilities not having a financial assistance, at least for some portion of the child care facilities, I guess this is what the state would have to wrestle with. It has provided $100 million to schools, but there's been no financial assistance provided to child care facilities, and whether that's required or not is an open issue, and it's a fair question.
I don't know if Chris Daggett or Mike Furrey have anything they want to add to that answer.
Well, I think the challenge on and Gary talked about if you have, whether it's a daycare center or a school, is what's the best way to remediate, and that's a challenge, and it's going to be school by school, depending on what levels they have, the age of the schools, and it is a challenge in how to address, whether it's through chemical treatment, removing plumbing, or putting filters. There's a lot of options that are available, and that has to be looked at, and a plan has to be developed.
Yeah, and the good news on schools is that there is $100 million that voters approved for this, which will help a lot of school districts. I think the situation with child care centers is something that we're particularly concerned about. There's a lot of child care centers that are in families' homes, and then there are also, bigger facilities, and as of yet, there's no financial assistance for those. So we think that's an area that's ripe for, more investigation and probably some state support. But we haven't looked into it or done the research yet. And if anyone else has, please email Gary and let him know. Something we'd love to collaborate on.
Yeah, as I think Chris Daggett mentioned at the top of this, if a child is drinking formula and that formula is made with water that has a fair amount of lead in it, that could easily be, according to EPA, 60% of their exposure to lead. So it's just another issue why child care facilities are of great concern to us. Another question here, which is related, wouldn't smaller child care facilities be put out of business by the cost? And I think the point we're trying to make here is that the combination of the rate, spreading the rates, increase over 10 years and over the entire service area, and the state subsidy for the cost, they should absolve the reason for the initial part of the program had a cost share component to it. So it's not obviously the rates are paid by everybody who's in the service area, but getting out of the business of having a cost share attached to this is a sort of fundamental to what this report is recommending that the state of New Jersey do.
Just a reminder, as Gary's looking for the next question, folks, if you have a question, just click on the top golden circle with the the second from the left, what do you call that? And you can type in your question, and we're reading them off here.
You have another one, Gary?
We are sort of combing through here to find another one. So there's a recommendation. This has to do with, I believe, procurement. The recommendation that the state procure state contracts that can be utilized by local utilities for lead service line inventories and the pipe replacements to leverage bulk pricing. And I think the point here is that, I think I'm interpreting this right, instead of all the water utilities going out and separately arranging for those kinds of contracts, would there be a way to have a cooperative contracting approach to that? That is obviously something that's a fair point. I think it might be a little administratively difficult in some cases, but anytime we can do that, that might reduce the cost. But I think there might be some challenges to doing that, in part because we have investor-owned utilities, we have municipal utilities, we have a whole smattering of different types of utilities across the state, which are quite different in many respects.
Yeah. There's a question here. What sort of disruption will lead service line replacement cause to property, and will it be cleaned up when the process is complete or left to the property owner?
Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah. The average, the estimate for a lead service line replacement, it could be as little as $5,000 up to $10,000, which that's probably the average cost is about $10,000, depending on the size of the lead service line, the length of the pipe, the size of that, if it's a commercial versus residential. There are new technologies that are available that could be a little bit less invasive, and that could be implemented, but that's probably the average cost. There most likely will be subsidies and money available for homeowners to do that. I encourage any homeowner to take advantage of that opportunity to replace a lead service line at the least amount of cost as possible. Like Chris says, it's difficult to convince a homeowner to do this, but the AWWA highly recommends full service line replacement instead of partial lead service line replacement. So that's the average cost, about approximately $10,000.
All right, we have another question here. Is the state doing anything to crack down on cheap fixtures that are being sold at big box improvement stores that are high in lead content?
I think that might be good for Mike Furrey.
Yes, I'll go right back to me. Yeah, what's interesting is they're trying to make all these fittings, valves, fixtures lead-free, and there's a push to do that. It's very difficult to regulate that because it's, these things make it into the market and get into the homes. So I think, we talk about lead service line replacement. There is the premise plumbing on site where the lead solder can come from, and the only effective way to demonstrate that, and the most effective way, is when you go take a sample. You take a first and second draw sample. You let the water sit for a while. Take the sample, let it run for a short period of time, and take another sample. That's the easiest way to identify if the fixture is the source of the lead. And if that's the source, you can either physically remove the fixture, or you can add a filtering product that would remove it effectively.
We have another question here. Is it anticipated that there will be sufficient contractors available to replace all the lead service lines in 10 years?
This is Gary. So I would maybe take a first stab at that and say that our anticipation is that, in part because it's being done over 10 years, there's going to be some degree of growth in that industry. The work that's involved here is not terrifically complex. Some preliminary indications from some of the contractors associations in the state is that they will respond to a situation if they know there's that much work over a 10-year period, that the number of contractors that exist today could easily grow as in response to work. We also know that to some degree, as money is metered out, it will have the effect of metering out the work. It's a fair question when it's a bottleneck, but I think the combination of metering out the money and the expected growth in the industry of people willing to do the work should help us address some of this particular question.
Okay. We have another question regarding the data portal that Chris Sturm is going to answer.
Yeah, so people might be curious what we were talking about. In 2017, New Jersey Future was curious about the results of the water testing in schools, and we asked the Department of Education for the results. At that time, they were not compiling them, so we OPRA'd them, through an Open Public Records Act, and created our own spreadsheet where we compiled the responses. Since we did that, other researchers have done similar compilations. Basically, we had to have summer interns looking at PDFs and entering numbers into spreadsheets. What we recommend instead, and where the DEP is moving, is to create, and the Department of Education is hopefully moving, is to create an automatic data portal where information can be entered electronically, and there can be better quality control because there are fields that specify exactly what kind of information should be entered at what time. The information then automatically populates a spreadsheet, which allows for sort of instant tallying and analysis. So that's what we're looking for.
All right, there's another question.
Just to add to that, this is Mike Furrey. The water industry already has something called Drinking Water Watch, and that's the website you can go to if you want to look at your individual water system. So if they were going to model any kind of database system, that would be a pretty effective way of tracking these lead results for schools.
All right, we've got another question here. If the legislature provides permissible access to the water utility, how will access be obtained to the private interior space where a lead service line penetrates the exterior wall?
So this is Gary, and I'll invite Mike to chime in as well if he'd like, but there is a definition about where the lead service line stops and definitional issue of where the lead service line stops and where indoor plumbing begins. Typically, the pipe would protrude as it first comes into the house onto at least some type of a shutoff valve. In some cases, the meter is also inside the home, and that's owned by the water utility. So typically, if there's access being provided through state law for the purpose of replacing the lead service line, it would replace the line all the way up to at least to that point. And I think the question maybe is asking if it were to extend beyond that or from the exterior wall. And I think that whole issue, which is a little bit of a nuanced issue about where do you stop with the replacement, I guess at the moment the thinking is that it should at least go to the point where it protrudes from the wall and it goes up to the shutoff valve.
All right. If anyone has any other additional questions, you can reach out to the speakers after this, and we're going to turn it back over to Chris Sturm.
Okay, before we advance the slide, I just want to point out that the full report is available on the Jersey Waterworks website, and it has a lot more details than you heard from us today, so I encourage you to check that out. I'm just going to talk briefly about some of the things that are happening to implement this. You know, the situation in Newark was really unfortunate, but it galvanized attention by elected officials and action. And so on October 10th, the day that the task force released its report, Governor Murphy attended the press event and announced his own comprehensive statewide plan to address lead exposure in New Jersey, lead from all sources, including water, and he embraced a number of the task force recommendations. You can find a summary of his announcement on his website under press releases, and just look for October 10th. The next thing that's happened is also on October 10th, which was purely a coincidence, the EPA announced proposed changes to the federal lead and copper rule that Mike mentioned. These changes are, many of them are very good and protective of public health. When it comes to lead service line replacement, they actually took a step backwards. But nevertheless, those are out there. And at the same time, as Mike also mentioned, the DEP is pursuing rulemaking to tighten the state's version of the lead and copper rule. In New Jersey, the state actually implements the federal standards. So that's going on. And then the legislature is working very actively on this. They, the Senate Community and Urban Affairs Committee, did I get that right? Senate Community, yes, thank you. Yesterday considered a package of 3 bills that addressed lead service line inventory and replacement, lead disclosure, and public access. And the senators indicated that they are working on a whole assortment of other related bills. There was a unanimous vote in the committee to advance the bill, which will go next to the Senate Budget Committee. And I think there's a hope, I can't speak for the legislature, but our sense is that they want to try to accomplish at least part of this during lame duck. So all of these, you know, all of this progress is very encouraging. Mike, back to you to talk about what AWWA is up to.
Yes, thanks, Chris. We're happy to announce we're going to put on a lead in drinking water forum. It's going to be taking place December 17th of 2019, where we have invited various toxicologists. We have invited New Jersey Future. We've also we're bringing in a national representative from the EPA, Mr. Mike Schock, a lead and drinking water expert. And we have people from the city of Newark, Mayor Baraka, and some other great speakers to talk about lead in drinking water. That's December 17th of this year. It's going to be located right in Newark, New Jersey at NJDEP. We're going to be working with the students, and we're going to also be Facebook Living it and putting it on the internet. So I encourage you to go to the AWWA New Jersey website and register for that forum. And I appreciate the opportunity to work collectively with New Jersey Waterworks on this program. So we're excited about that.
All right, and for Everyone else who's interested in what's happening in the water world of New Jersey, the Jersey Waterworks Conference is going to be held December 13th at the Hyatt Regency in New Brunswick. George Hawkins, formerly of DC Water, now with Moonshot Emissions, is going to be our keynote speaker, talking about all the wonderful things that are happening with utilities in New Jersey and across the country. But of interest, if you want to learn a little bit more about this lead report, the lead task force and some additional members are going to be doing a breakout session in the afternoon where we hope they'll be able to dive a little deeper into some of the policy areas and recommendations from the report. So again, that's going to be on December 13th. You can go to the jerseywaterworks.org website to join the collaborative as well as to register for the conference. And if you have any other questions about the work that Jersey Waterworks does, you can get our contact information there and read a little bit more about us. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Chris Daggett.
Yeah, thanks very much, Ed. Just to wrap it up, the focus of this whole effort is on executive actions, primarily policy changes in various state departments, ECA, DOE on the central database, transparency initiatives at DEP and among the water utilities, legislation around disclosure, inventory, lead service line replacement and funding, regulatory updates on primarily DEP regulations and protective measures in the home, and putting together a holistic campaign where we get all the agencies of the state that are working on this in some coordinated effort to reach our goal of getting rid of lead in drinking water in the next 10 years. So with that, unless Chris or Gary or Mike want to say anything else, I think that pretty much concludes the session. We appreciate everybody taking part. Again, we appreciate the support of Jersey Waterworks and the support of the Fund for New Jersey for underwriting this work. Chris or Gary or Mike?
No, just thank our audience for joining us and being part of this conversation.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.